A young Air Force officer sat across from his mentor in 1973. The mentor was a quiet colonel named John Boyd. Boyd drew an invisible fork in the road on the desk between them. "If you go that way," he said, "you can be somebody. You'll get the promotions, you'll join the club, but you will have to compromise yourself." Then he pointed the other way. "Or you can go that way. You can do something. Your work might actually matter, but you may never be promoted." He leaned forward. "To be or to do? Which way will you go?" That question is the spine of one of the most quietly devastating books written this century. Ryan Holiday called it "Ego is the Enemy." 3 words he had tattooed on his own forearm so that every morning when he stepped out of the shower, he would be reminded. But here is what most people get wrong about that title. When Holiday says ego, he doesn't mean Freud. He doesn't mean the polished thing the textbooks describe. He means something much closer to home. That quiet, petulant voice inside almost every ambitious person that insists you are better, that you deserve more, that the rules don't quite apply to you in the same way they apply to everyone else. An unhealthy belief in your own importance. That's it. That's the definition. And here's the strange part. Ego doesn't come for the talented in order to crush them. It comes for them precisely because they are talented. The same drive that gets you to the top of a field. The same conviction that you can do what others cannot. That drive is what ego rides into your mind and slowly turns into something poisonous. Most people think their biggest enemy is some external force. The competition, the market, the unfair boss, the bad break, the wrong timing. But the argument here is that you have been looking in the wrong direction your entire life. Over the next hour, I am going to walk you through every major idea in this book. The 3 stages where ego attacks, the historical figures who beat it, and the ones who let it destroy them. We'll meet a Civil War general who refused to take command because he honestly didn't think he was ready yet. A football coach who took the worst team in the entire league and refused to let anyone call him a genius after he turned them into champions. A general who turned down the most important job of his life because he thought someone else should have it. And a young man sitting in a prison cell at 21 years old who turned a 10-year sentence into the most liberating period of his life by doing something almost nobody else in that cell block thought to do. These are the people who learn to fight the enemy inside. And the story begins with someone who couldn't. Part 1. Silence over spectacle. In 1934, in the middle of the Great Depression, a man named Upton Sinclair did something almost no political candidate has ever done before or since. He was running for governor of California in what would become one of the first truly modern American elections. He was a famous author. He knew how to communicate with the public. So before he had won a single vote, before a single ballot had been counted, he sat down at his desk and he wrote a book. The book was titled, "I, Governor of California, and How I Ended Poverty." Notice the verb tense, ended, past tense. He wrote it in the voice of a man looking back at his triumphant time in office, describing the brilliant policies he had passed, the suffering he had relieved, the state he had transformed. He had not yet won the election. You can probably guess what happened next. The book sold beautifully. The campaign collapsed. Sinclair lost by something like 250,000 votes, a margin of more than 10 percentage points. Decimated. But the strange thing, the thing his friends noticed, was not that he lost. It was how he lost. Sinclair seemed to lose interest in the campaign somewhere along the way. A man who watched it up close later said it was as if Sinclair had already lived through being governor in his own head. He had already acted out the role. So why bother to enact it in real life? He had drained the well before he ever reached the river. And this is the first and most underrated trap that ego sets for ambitious people. Because here's the thing. Talking feels like doing. Posting feels like doing. Telling people about your plans, your goals, your dreams, that feels like progress. It scratches the same itch. It releases some of the same chemicals. But it isn't progress. The research is actually pretty clear on this. After a certain point, the mind starts to confuse visualization and verbalization with achievement itself. Talk too much about what you're going to do, and some part of your brain begins to feel that you've already done it. The energy you needed to actually do the thing, That energy quietly bleeds out into the conversation. And the harder the task is, the more uncertain the outcome, the more you want to talk about it. Because talking is comfort. Talking is therapy. Talking is a way to feel like you're making progress without ever having to face the silence and the doubt and the hard, awful work of actually creating something. Silence is the respite of the confident and the strong. There's a writer named Emily Gould who put this brutally well a few years back. She had a 6-figure book deal, a real signed and funded book deal to write a novel. And for an entire year, she got essentially nothing done. She admitted later that she could barely remember anything she did in 2010 except scrolling, tweeting, posting, reblogging. She told herself she was building her brand. She told herself that curating someone else's content was a creative act if you squinted at it just right. She told herself she was working, but she wasn't writing the novel. And if you were being honest with yourself right now, you can probably name the thing you have been doing the same way. The Instagram story about the project you haven't started. The post about the career pivot you keep meaning to make. The long, late-night conversation with a friend about the book you're going to write, the company you're going to launch, the body you're going to build. Why do we do this? The simplest answer is that the silence of actually doing the work is terrifying. Sitting at the desk and staring at the blank page, pressing the buttons and watching nothing happen. Trying the thing and watching it fail. The void, as Marlon Brando once put it, is terrifying to most people. And ego is the salve. Ego is the voice that whispers, "You've talked about this for hours now, doesn't that count for something?" The answer, devastatingly, is no. But there is a second trap waiting for you in this stage, and it is even cleverer than the first, because the world tells you something else. The world tells you that the cure for not doing is passion. Find your passion. Live with passion. Be the most passionate person in the room. Once, early in her career, a visitor came to see Eleanor Roosevelt and complimented her on her passionate interest in a piece of social legislation. He meant it as a compliment. He thought he was paying her one of the highest compliments a public figure could receive. Her response was quiet, almost cold. "Yes," she said, "but I hardly think the word passionate applies to me." She didn't think she was passionate. The woman who became the most influential First Lady in American history, who reshaped human rights as we now understand them, did not think she was passionate. She thought she had something else. She thought she had purpose. And there is a distinction inside that word that almost nobody makes. Passion is about. I'm passionate about this cause. I'm passionate about my work. The grammar of passion always points back at the self, at what I feel. But purpose is different. Purpose is to and for. I was put here to accomplish this. I am willing to endure that for the sake of this. Purpose almost de-emphasizes the I altogether. John Wooden, the coach who built the greatest dynasty in college basketball, who won 10 championships in 12 years, 7 of them in a row, once had a player describe his coaching style. The player, by the way, would later change his name to one you would recognize, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. And the word he used for Wooden was dispassionate. Not unfeeling, not robotic. Dispassionate, calm, in control. Never, in Wooden's own words, passion's slave. Because passion, for all its surface excitement, has a flaw. It is loud, it is expensive, it burns hot and burns out, and it almost always covers a weakness, a lack of patience, a lack of plan, a lack of the slow, deliberate, methodical work that the actual accomplishment requires. But here's the trickiest part of this entire stage. Because even if you avoid the talking trap, and even if you avoid the passion trap, there is a third one waiting for you the second you taste a little success. In the early 1700s, a young man, barely 18 years old, returned to Boston after running away from it 7 months before. He had a new suit, he had a watch, he had a pocket full of coins he liked to spread out on tables to show people he ran into. He was, by any reasonable measure, a kid who had gotten ahead of himself. His name was Benjamin Franklin. On that trip, he had a meeting with one of Boston's most respected figures, a man named Cotton Mather. The two of them were walking down a hallway together, with the young, posturing Franklin doing what young, posturing people have always done, talking himself up. And as they walked, Mather suddenly said something strange. "Stoop, stoop." Franklin, lost in his own performance, didn't process it in time. He walked directly into a low ceiling beam. A hard, embarrassing thump on the forehead. Mather's response is one of the most generous things one person has ever said to another. "Let this be a caution to you," he said. "Not always to hold your head so high. Stoop, young man, stoop as you go through this world, and you'll miss many hard thumps." Franklin spent the rest of his very long life remembering that moment. Because pride, early pride especially, is the deceptively gentle setup for almost every catastrophic fall. Pride takes a minor accomplishment and convinces you it's a major one. It smiles at your cleverness as though what you've done so far is just a hint of the greatness about to come. And the moment that voice starts speaking to you, the moment you start telling yourself you already are what you have only just begun to become, you stop being a student, you stop listening, and, like a young man with his head held high, you walk directly into something you should have seen coming. The writer Anne Lamott has a name for this voice in your head. She calls it radio station KFKD. And she warns young writers that if they aren't careful, it will play in their inner ear 24 hours a day. Out of one speaker, she says, comes the endless self-aggrandizement. How special you are, how misunderstood, how brilliant, how original. And out of the other speaker comes the doubt, the self-loathing, the sense that everything you touch turns to nothing. Both of those voices are the same voice. Both of them are ego. And as long as either one of them is playing, you can't actually hear the world around you. You can't hear what your work really sounds like. You can't hear what people are actually telling you. You're just performing for an imaginary audience that doesn't exist. If talking doesn't get you there, if passion doesn't get you there, and if early success is the most reliable thing to ruin you, then what does the climb actually look like? To find out, we need to go back to the man we left in 1973. The one drawing a fork on a desk, Part 2. The work that earns the title. So who was the man drawing the fork on the desk? John Boyd is one of the most influential military thinkers of the 20th century. Almost no one outside the military knows his name. He never wrote a book. He published exactly one academic paper. There's only a handful of videos of him in existence, and despite nearly 30 years of brilliant service in the Air Force, he was never promoted beyond the rank of colonel. So what did he do? He invented the F-15. He invented the F-16. He rebuilt the entire theory of maneuver warfare from scratch, transforming nearly every branch of the US military. His private briefings shaped the war plans for Operation Desert Shield. He mentored an entire generation of generals, but there are no battleships named after John Boyd, no bases named after him. He retired with a small apartment and a pension, assuming he would be forgotten. He almost certainly had more enemies than friends. And the strangest thing about it is that this was deliberate. This was the choice. Boyd had picked the second fork in his own life, to do something instead of being somebody. And then he spent the rest of his career teaching it to every promising young officer who came under his wing. He used to write something on a chalkboard for them. He would write the words duty, honor, country in big letters at the top. Then he would cross them out, one by one, and replace them with 3 different words: pride, power, greed. His point was that the systems we navigate to get ahead can quietly corrupt the very values they were built to serve. Every institution, every industry, every career has both versions running side by side. And ego doesn't just nudge you toward the wrong version. Ego whispers that the wrong version is the right one, that promotion is the work, that the title is the talent, that impressing people is being impressive. So how do you keep from sliding from one side of the chalkboard to the other? Boyd never said this explicitly, but his life suggests an answer. You have to keep yourself in the only position where ego cannot survive. The position of the student. On a single day in the early 1980s, in a decrepit warehouse in New York, a young guitarist named Dave Mustaine showed up for a recording session and was told by the rest of his band that he was being kicked out. They handed him a bus ticket. The band was called Metallica. They were a few years away from becoming one of the biggest bands in the entire world. That same day, in San Francisco, A barely known guitarist in his early 20s named Kirk Hammett was offered the open spot. A few days later, he played his first show with them. "If you had handed me that opportunity at 22 years old, I would have walked into my first rehearsal believing I had arrived, believing the universe had finally recognized what I always knew, believing the work was done." Hammett did the opposite. He went back home to San Francisco, to his apartment in the city, and he looked for a guitar teacher. Not a peer, not a collaborator, a teacher. He found a man named Joe Satriani, who was teaching out of a small music shop in Berkeley. Satriani had a reputation for being merciless. Several of Hammett's contemporaries had already stormed out of Satriani's lessons in tears, complaining that the man was too harsh. Hammett showed up anyway. For the next 2 years, while he was playing in front of tens of thousands of people in stadiums, while his band was becoming a global phenomenon, Kirk Hammett came back every single week to that music shop in Berkeley, to be told what he was doing wrong, to be drilled in the fundamentals he had skipped on his way up, and then he became one of the greatest metal guitarists in the history of recorded music. So what is going on there? Why would someone who just joined the biggest band in the world voluntarily put himself back in the position of a student? Because Hammett understood something most of us never quite figure out. The pretense of knowledge, the act of pretending you already know, is the single most dangerous habit you can pick up, because it cuts you off from ever getting any better. There's a phrase the Stoic philosopher Epictetus used. It is impossible to learn that which one thinks one already knows. You cannot learn if you think you already know. You will not find the answers if you are too conceited to ask the questions. You cannot get better if you are convinced you are already the best. The fighter Frank Shamrock used to teach his trainees a system he called plus, minus, and equal. Every great fighter, he said, needs 3 relationships running at all times: someone better than you that you can learn from, someone weaker than you that you can teach, and someone your equal that you can challenge yourself against. The plus keeps you humble, the minus keeps you sharp, the equal keeps you honest. Now I want to tell you about a young high school kid who was so obsessed with football that he basically functioned as an assistant coach while he was still playing the games himself. His father had taught him a strange rule. If you ever want to give a coach feedback, his father said, do it in private. Make sure it sounds like you're agreeing with him. Never make him look bad in front of the team. The kid learned how to be quietly indispensable without ever being threatening. That kid grew up and became Bill Belichick. His first job in the NFL, for the Baltimore Colts, he volunteered to take without pay. He took the work everybody else hated. Hours and hours of analyzing grainy film footage that the senior coaches found tedious. And every insight he pulled out of that film, every strategic gem he uncovered, was credited to the men above him. As one coach put it later, you would give Belichick an assignment and he would disappear into a room and you wouldn't see him until it was done, and then he would ask for more. There is a name for what Belichick was doing. The Romans had a word for someone who clears the path for the person above them: anti-ambulo, literally, one who walks before. Most people, when they are starting out, cannot stand this. It feels degrading. It feels like the universe is wasting them. There's a young writer in ancient Rome named Martial, a brilliant poet, who spent most of his adult life as an anti-ambulo to wealthy patrons, and his work is shot through with bitterness about it. He couldn't believe he was being made to grovel like this. He hated every minute of it. But here is the irony. Martial's outsider perspective on Roman culture is precisely what makes his poetry survive 2,000 years later. The system he resented was the system that made him. He just couldn't see it while he was inside it. The person who clears the path ultimately controls its direction. The canvas shapes the painting, even if no one notices the canvas. And one last thing about this stage, because it's the one most ambitious people are not prepared for. When you are climbing, the world is not always going to be kind to you. You will be slighted. You will be passed over. You will be talked down to by people who haven't done a fraction of what you have. You will watch someone less qualified get the thing you deserved, and every cell in your body is going to scream at you to push back. Jackie Robinson, the first black player in Major League Baseball, was hit by more than 72 pitches during his career. Players tried to slice his Achilles tendon with their spikes. Fans screamed slurs at him from the stands. A manager from another team named Ben Chapman shouted at him over and over during one game, "They're waiting for you in the jungles, black boy." Robinson wanted to grab the man and smash his teeth in with what he later called his despised black fist. He didn't. A month later, he agreed to take a friendly photograph with Chapman to help save the man's job. Branch Rickey, the manager of the Dodgers, the man who had chosen Robinson for this experiment, had asked him one question before signing him. "I'm looking," he said, "for a ball player with the guts not to fight back." That was the deal. That was the cost of doing the thing that needed to be done. Restraint, in the moments your ego is screaming the loudest. That's the work. Most paths in life are like a tightrope. The tightrope will tolerate skill. It will tolerate effort. It will not tolerate the lurching reactions of an ego that needs to be respected at all times. Doing the unrecognized work. Staying a student after you've made it. Clearing the path for someone above you. Eating the insult that did not deserve to be eaten. That is what the climb actually looks like. And then, if you do it long enough, something even more dangerous happens. You succeed. Part 3. The stories we tell after we win. In 1979, the San Francisco 49ers were the worst team in professional football. The year before a new head coach took over, they had finished 2 wins and 14 losses. The organization was demoralized. The locker room was broken. They had no draft picks left. They had fully ensconced themselves in what people in the league called a culture of losing. His first season as head coach, they lost another 14 games, 2-14. Again, imagine that. Imagine taking over the worst franchise in your industry, throwing yourself into the work for a full year, and ending up in the exact same place you started. He nearly resigned halfway through his second season. He honestly wasn't sure he could do this job. 2 seasons later, they won the Super Bowl. In the years that followed, sports writers started calling him the genius. He went on to win 3 more Super Bowls, 9 division titles in a single decade, the fastest turnaround in NFL history. His name was Bill Walsh, and he spent the rest of his career rejecting the title they had given him, because Walsh knew something the writers didn't. He knew that none of it was the result of some grand vision. He had never set a timetable for winning the Super Bowl. He had never promised anyone they would be champions. When people asked him whether he had a plan for getting to the top, his answer was always no. Because for a team that bad, such ambitions would have been delusional. So what did he do? He installed something he called the standard of performance. The standard of performance was a list of behaviors. Quarterbacks were told where and how to hold the ball. Linemen were drilled on 30 separate fundamentals. Passing routes were measured down to the inch. Practices were scheduled to the minute. The locker room had to be neat and clean. Coaches had to wear ties and tuck their shirts in. Players couldn't sit down on the practice field. No smoking, no swearing, no fighting. In Walsh's eyes, if the players took care of the details, the score would take care of itself. The winning would happen. He didn't know when. He just knew that if every person in the organization committed to the standard, the rest of it was a fortunate break of the game. And then it happened faster than it ever had for any coach in history. So why would Walsh refuse the title of genius? Why would he insist for the rest of his life that the result was not the plan? Because he understood the most dangerous trap that ego sets after you have won. The trap of the story. The moment you succeed, your mind begins building a narrative around it. A clean, satisfying, retroactive story. You start telling yourself, I knew this would work. I had it figured out from the beginning. The doubts I had at the time, the times I almost quit, the moments I got lucky, those quietly get edited out. What's left is a polished version of yourself that you start to actually believe. You become a caricature of your own success. And here's why that matters. Because the next thing the team did after winning the Super Bowl was lose. They lost 12 of their next 22 games. The same group of men, the same coach, the same playbook. The thing that changed was that they had started believing they were special. They had cracked the code. The standard didn't apply to them in quite the same way anymore. They were the champions now, and the moment they returned wholeheartedly to the standard of performance, they started winning again. 3 more Super Bowls, 9 more division titles, a decade of dominance. The story is the enemy of the work, always. Now I want to take you somewhere darker, because there's a moment in history that captures what happens when the storytelling impulse gets totally unchecked. When the person believing the story has so much power that no one can talk them out of it. In the 5th century before the Common Era, the Persian Emperor Xerxes was leading an invasion of Greece. To get his army across the strait that separates Asia from Europe, a body of water called the Hellespont, he ordered his engineers to build a series of bridges. The engineers spent days constructing them, and then, just before his army was set to cross, a storm came up. The waters surged. The bridges were destroyed. Xerxes responded by ordering his men to whip the sea, 300 lashes, by hand, with chains. They were ordered to brand the water with hot irons. They were ordered to deliver a verbal harangue while they were doing it, to inform the salt and bitter stream that their master was punishing it for the injury it had caused him. And he beheaded the engineers who had built the bridges in the first place. Before he crossed the Hellespont, Xerxes had also written a letter to a nearby mountain that his army needed to cut a canal through. "You may be tall and proud," he wrote, "but don't you dare cause me any trouble. Otherwise I will topple you into the sea." How preposterous is that? How pathetic. And yet, strip the costume, strip the language, strip the geographic distance of 2,500 years. How different is that from the modern executive who screams at the customer service representative on the phone, the CEO who flies into a rage because his coffee was cold, the person who cannot understand why the airline employee will not just make an exception for them just this once because of who they are. Success casts a spell on us, and the spell is dangerous in 3 specific ways. First, it tells us we are entitled, that whatever we have, we earned, and whatever we want, we deserve. Second, it tells us we are in control, that the world is a system that responds to our will, and the moments when it doesn't are mistakes we need to correct. And third, it tells us we are surrounded by enemies, by people who don't appreciate us, who are scheming against us, who would steal what's ours the moment we look away. Entitlement, control, paranoia, the 3 children of success. Every single one of them ego in a costume. At the end of the American Civil War, 2 men stood at the top of their generation. They had won. They were heroes. They were both offered, more or less, anything they wanted from a grateful country. One was William Tecumseh Sherman. The other was Ulysses S. Grant. Sherman politely declined politics. He said he had all the rank he wanted, and retired quietly to New York, where by all accounts he lived in contentment. Grant went the other way. He ran for president. He won by a landslide, and he presided over one of the most corrupt and ineffective administrations in American history. He left office a maligned and controversial figure. Then he invested almost every penny he had into a financial firm with a partner who turned out to be a Ponzi schemer. The fortune Grant had built up was wiped out publicly, and humiliatingly, he spent the final years of his life racing to finish his memoirs so that he could leave his family with something to live on after his death. Sherman said something about his old friend that has stayed with me. Grant, he said, had aimed to rival the millionaires who would have given everything they had to win even one of Grant's battles. He had accomplished so much, and he couldn't see what was important to him because he could not stop chasing what was important to someone else. That is what success does to most of us. It doesn't take what we have. It takes our ability to see what we have. It makes us run faster, but it never tells us we are running on someone else's track. Walsh saw this clearly. He saw it because he refused the story everyone wanted to tell about him. He stayed obsessed with the only thing that had ever worked, the standard. The little things, the unsexy details no one writes a headline about. But staying focused on the work is only half of the answer, because the other half is even harder. The other half is staying sane. Part 4. Staying sober at the top. In 1924, an 18-year-old kid in Houston inherited a fortune. His father, a brilliant inventor, had died suddenly from a heart attack, leaving the boy 3/4 of a tool company worth nearly $1 million at the time. The kid was quiet, reserved, sheltered. and he had a vision for what he was going to do with what he had been handed. His name was Howard Hughes. He moved to Los Angeles. He decided to become a filmmaker. He traded stocks from his bedside and lost more than $8 million in the run-up to the Great Depression. He made one famous movie called Hell's Angels, which took 3 years to produce, lost $1.5 million, and nearly bankrupted the family tool company in the process. Then he lost another $4 million on Chrysler stock in 1930, so he pivoted to aviation. He started a defense contractor called Hughes Aircraft. He won 2 government contracts during World War II worth $40 million at taxpayer expense and produced almost nothing useful for the war effort. His most famous plane, an enormous flying boat that he insisted on calling the Hercules, cost $20 million to develop, flew exactly one time for less than a mile, 70 feet above the water, and was then stored in an air-conditioned hangar in Long Beach at a cost of $1 million a year for decades. So he bought a movie studio called RKO, lost $22 million, and laid off 3/4 of the employees as he ran it into the ground. Near the end of his life, Howard Hughes spent his days sitting naked in a white chair, unwashed, unkempt, surrounded by paperwork. He would dictate long, rambling memos to his staff about Kleenex, about how his food was to be prepared, about how no employee was allowed to speak to him directly. He died in an asylum of his own making. He had nearly everything a person could acquire in this life, and he enjoyed almost none of it. Now I want you to imagine a different story. A few years into World War II, the Allies were preparing for the largest coordinated military invasion in human history, D-Day, and the man who had trained his entire life for the role of commanding it was an army officer named George the 100th Marshall. He had served in 2 world wars. He had reshaped the entire American military. He had earned this moment, and President Roosevelt knew it. So Roosevelt let him know, quietly, privately, that the assignment was his if he wanted it. Marshall said no. He said it without drama. He said it without complaint. He said, in essence, "The decision is yours, Mr. President. My wishes have nothing to do with it." He had concluded that the country needed him more in Washington, coordinating the entire war effort, than it needed him on a beach in Normandy. So he handed the role to someone else, a man named Dwight Eisenhower. Now you and I both know what command of D-Day would have meant for Marshall's legacy. We can name Eisenhower today partly because of what that invasion did for him. Marshall could have had that. He chose not to. How does a person do that? Because Marshall knew what most people in his position never know. He knew the difference between wanting honors and needing them. He knew that ego needs recognition in order to feel real, but confidence does not. Confidence can wait. Confidence can hand the trophy to someone else and walk back to its desk. There's a coach named Pat Riley who has a name for what happens to most successful teams. He calls it the disease of me. He says that early on, before a team has won anything, they have what he calls the innocent climb. The bonds are simple. People look out for each other. They share the work, but the moment they win, the bonds start to fray. Chests swell. Players calculate their own importance. Frustrations emerge. The disease arrives. Riley has watched it strike championship teams in every sport, in every league, in every decade. Some lasted longer than others. Almost none escaped it entirely. What was unusual about George Marshall is that, somehow, he never caught it. President Truman, who watched him serve at the highest levels of American government for years, once said that of everyone he had ever encountered in the military or politics, Marshall was the rare exception. The man, Truman said, who never thought about himself. There is a story about Marshall sitting for one of the many official portraits that came with his position. He showed up. He sat for hours. He did exactly what the artist asked, and when the artist finally said the painting was finished, Marshall stood up and started to leave. The artist stopped him. "Don't you want to see the portrait?" "No," Marshall said respectfully, and he walked out. He didn't even want to look, because what was the point? Now I want to introduce you to someone alive in our time who has lived this same principle. A few years back, the Russian President Vladimir Putin held a meeting with the German Chancellor Angela Merkel. He knew before the meeting began that Merkel was not a dog lover. So in the middle of their conversation, he had his large black hunting dog walk into the room. A clear, deliberate, juvenile intimidation tactic. Merkel did not flinch. She sat there, she continued the conversation, she let the dog wander around. Later, she joked about it publicly. The man who tried to scare her ended up being the one who looked foolish. Merkel is the antithesis of almost everything we expect from a head of state. She is plain. She is modest. She does not care about presentation or flash. She does not give fiery speeches. She doesn't make sweeping promises. And she became one of the most powerful and durable leaders in modern Europe, 3 terms in office, by being relentlessly sober, almost boringly so, in a profession that rewards theatrics. The historian Shelby Foote once observed that power doesn't so much corrupt. That's too simple. Power, he said, fragments. It closes options. It mesmerizes. It clouds the mind precisely when the mind needs to be clearest. Sobriety is the counterweight. Sobriety is the prevention method. And it is not abstinence in the way we usually think of the word. It is the elimination of the unnecessary and the destructive. No more obsessing about your image. No more treating people beneath you with contempt. No more performing for the room. No more believing that the rules don't apply to you because of who you have become. So how do you actually do this? How do you cultivate sobriety in the middle of being told constantly how special you are? In 1879, an explorer named John Muir took his first trip to Alaska. He found himself standing in front of one of those moments that humans almost never get, a vista where the entire ecosystem seemed to lay itself out in front of him at once. The tides marching back and forth, the forests feeding on sunbeams, the bears in the berry tangles, the wild sheep on the ridges above the woods, the mink and the beaver and the otter, insects stirring all the air, birds tending to their young. He wrote about it later. What he had felt was a sense of universal belonging. The Stoics had a word for that feeling, sympathia, a sense of being part of something far larger than yourself. The astrophysicist Neil deGrasse Tyson says something similar when he describes looking up at the universe at night. He says he knows he's small, but he also knows he's big, because he's connected to the universe, and the universe is connected to him. When you have power, you forget that. When you have power, the world becomes a stage on which you are the protagonist. Other people become props. Inconveniences become a tax, and the ego that has been quietly inflating with every win finally finds itself in a room where no one will say no to it. Howard Hughes died in that room. Xerxes died in that room. George Marshall walked past that room. Every single day of his career, Marshall, Walsh, Merkel, what they all share is something almost impossible to describe in a culture that confuses volume with strength. They are quiet at the top. They do not need the room to react to them. They do not need anyone to confirm what they already know. The validation other people are constantly chasing, they have already let go of it. It is one of the most powerful and underrated capacities a human being can have. But there is one stage of life that all of this preparation is ultimately for. The stage where every story we have ever told ourselves stops working. The stage we have all been avoiding. The stage where the floor gives out. Part 5. Alive Time or Dead Time. In 1946, a young man stood in a courtroom in Boston and was sentenced to 10 years in prison. He was 21 years old. He had been arrested while trying to fence an expensive watch he had stolen, with a gun on him at the time. In his apartment, police had found jewelry, furs, an arsenal of weapons, and all the tools of an active burglary ring he had been leading on the streets of Detroit and Boston. He was guilty. He admitted it. He had run drugs. He had run numbers. He had worked as a pimp. He had escalated up to armed robbery. He had built a small criminal empire on the back of one fact, that he did not seem to be afraid to kill anyone or die in the attempt. His name at the time was Detroit Red. The world would come to know him by a different name, Malcolm X. So picture him, 21, behind bars, looking at 10 years, a criminal, a failure by almost every measure that society uses, and in front of him, an enormous block of time that was about to be taken from his life. There's a writer named Robert Greene who has a phrase for exactly this kind of moment. He says there are two kinds of time in life. There is dead time, when people are passive, when they are waiting, when they are simply letting the clock run out on circumstances they did not choose. And there is alive time, when people are learning, acting, building, becoming. Every situation we did not choose, every prison sentence, every layoff, every breakup, every diagnosis, every quiet stretch of our lives we did not plan for, presents the same choice: alive time or dead time. Which will it be? Malcolm X went to the prison library and he checked out two things: a pencil and a dictionary. And then he did something that is almost unbelievable when you sit with it for a moment. He copied the dictionary by hand, cover to cover, word by word, every definition, every page, every word that had ever existed in the English language that he had never been taught, that nobody had ever bothered to teach him. He wrote it down, he absorbed it, and once he had a vocabulary, he started reading. History, sociology, religion, philosophy, Kant, Spinoza, the classics. He read in his bunk, he read in the library, he read in every spare moment he had. Years later, when a reporter asked him about his college background, his answer was a single word: books. And here is the part that almost nobody catches when they hear this story. He said later that during those years in prison, he had never felt so truly free in his entire life. Whole months would pass when he did not think about being detained against his will, because in the only part of his world he could actually control, the inside of his own mind, he was no longer detained at all. He turned the worst circumstance of his life into the foundation of everything that came after it. Now think about your own life for a moment. Think about what you have been putting off, the hard conversation you keep dodging, the skill you have been meaning to learn, the book you have been meaning to read, the system you have been meaning to fix, the work that does not feel exciting but that you know, in the quiet part of yourself, would actually change things. Dead time is revived the moment we use it as an opportunity to do what we already know we need to do. Now I want to tell you about a man who did not get the rewards Malcolm X eventually received. A man whose name is so forgotten that you have probably never heard it spoken out loud. His name was Belisarius. Belisarius lived in the 6th century. He was the highest-ranking general in what was left of the Roman Empire, serving under an emperor named Justinian. And by almost any measure, he was one of the greatest military commanders who ever lived. He saved Western civilization on at least 3 separate occasions. He won brilliant victories at Dara, Carthage, Naples, Sicily, and Constantinople. He once put down a riot that had grown so violent the emperor was preparing to flee, with nothing but a handful of bodyguards against a crowd of tens of thousands. He recaptured Rome itself from the barbarians, all before he was 40. His thanks? The emperor he served was paranoid and ungrateful. Belisarius was placed under suspicion again and again. His victories were undone with foolish treaties. The historian who had been assigned to record his accomplishments was bribed into smearing his legacy. At the end of his career, he was stripped of his wealth, demoted to a deliberately humiliating title, commander of the royal stable, and, according to one legend, blinded and forced to beg in the streets to survive. Historians have argued about this treatment for centuries. They are outraged on his behalf. They cannot believe the ingratitude. They cannot believe that a man who did so much was rewarded with so little. Painters have painted him. Poets have written verses about him. But there is one person in this entire story who never complained. Not at the time, not at the end of his life, not even in private letters that have survived. Belisarius himself. He saw his work as his sacred duty. He knew he had done it well. He knew he had done what was right. And in his mind, that was enough. The rewards, the honors, the recognition, the gratitude, those were not the point. Those had never been the point. If they came, they came. If they didn't, the work was still the work. Now contrast that with a writer named John Kennedy Toole, who wrote what most people now consider one of the great American comic novels of the 20th century. He could not get it published. He sent it out, he was rejected. He sent it again, he was rejected again. He believed so deeply that the value of his work depended on the world recognizing it, that he eventually drove out to an empty road in Mississippi and killed himself in his car. After his death, his mother found the manuscript. She fought for it. She got it published. It won the Pulitzer Prize. Think about that for a moment. Nothing about the book changed between the rejections and the prize. The book was the book. The only thing that changed was how the world happened to respond to it on a different day. If only he could have known. If only any of us could remember it. The work is the work. The validation is weather. It comes when it comes. John Wooden, the same coach who built the basketball dynasty, used to define success in a way almost nobody in his profession agreed with. Success, he said, is peace of mind, the direct result of self-satisfaction in knowing you made the effort to do your best, to become the best, that you are capable of becoming. The scoreboard in his mind was secondary. The standard was internal. Belisarius lived that. Malcolm X lived that. They are the alive ones, the ones whose circumstances did not get to define them. But there's one more piece of this stage, the hardest piece. Because some failures aren't the kind you walk away from with your dignity intact. Some failures bury you. Some failures are the worst thing that has ever happened to you. And the question, when you find yourself there, is not whether the world will treat you fairly. The question is whether you will turn it into something, or whether you will turn it into the rest of your life. Part 6. The Way Back Up. In 1963, in a house in Washington, D.C., a 46-year-old woman lay down for a nap. Her husband, a brilliant, charismatic, and increasingly unstable man, had been struggling for months with what we would now recognize as a severe mental breakdown. He had been drinking heavily, making erratic business decisions, having affairs, publicly humiliating her in front of friends and colleagues. She had spent the recent months trying to nurse him back to health. While she slept, he walked into the next room with a hunting rifle and killed himself. His name was Phil Graham. He had been the publisher of the Washington Post. Hers, the woman who napped in the next room, was Katharine Graham. And the moment she woke up, the position he had held was suddenly hers. The Washington Post Company. Thousands of employees, a vast media corporation, and no preparation, no warning, no experience of any kind. She had been, in her own words, content to be the tail to her husband's kite. Now the kite was gone. She had 3 children and a company, and she was, by any honest measure of the word, terrified. Let me ask you something. How many ways are there to fail in life? We tend to think there are only a few kinds. The big public crash, the bankruptcy, the scandal, the catastrophic mistake that lives in the headlines for a week. But the truth is that failure is endlessly creative. It comes in shapes we never imagined. It comes when we have already worked hard. It comes when we have done everything right. It comes from places we never thought to defend. Katharine Graham didn't cause her husband's suicide. She didn't choose to inherit a company she didn't feel qualified to run. None of this was her fault, and almost none of what came next would be either. A few years after she took over, the Post was on the verge of going public when an editor walked into her office. They had received a leaked collection of stolen government documents, a study prepared by the Pentagon on how American leaders had quietly lied to the public about the Vietnam War for decades. There was a court order forbidding publication. The company's lawyers told her not to do it. The board told her not to do it. Publishing could sink the IPO. It could tie the company up in lawsuits for years. She published them anyway. They became known as the Pentagon Papers. Shortly after that, 2 young reporters at her paper started investigating a strange burglary at the Democratic National Committee headquarters. Their source was anonymous. The trail led, slowly, terribly, to the most powerful office in the world, Watergate. And as the story grew, the Nixon White House decided that her paper was an enemy that needed to be destroyed. Nixon's Attorney General, the chief lawyer for the United States of America, threatened her by saying that her tit was going to be caught in a big fat ringer. Another aide bragged that the White House was now openly strategizing about how to do maximum damage to the Post. Imagine that. Imagine being a 48-year-old woman, thrust into a job you didn't ask for, and the most powerful office in the world is now openly conspiring to hurt you. But it kept going. The stock price suffered. An aggressive investor began buying up shares. A hostile takeover seemed imminent. Then a printers' union went on strike, and during the strike they sabotaged the printing presses, beat up a Post employee, and set one of the printing machines on fire. Her competitors, who would normally help out a fellow paper during a strike, refused. It cost the Post $300,000 a day and lost advertising revenue. What does ego do in a moment like that? Ego asks the question that ego always asks. Why is this happening to me? It blames. It demands fairness. It looks for someone else to hand the burden to. It says, this isn't worth it. This isn't my problem. I shouldn't have to deal with this. And it adds self-injury to every injury you have already taken. Katharine Graham didn't do any of that because she had figured out a quiet truth that most of us are still figuring out. Whether something is your fault or simply your problem does not actually matter because it is yours to deal with either way. The universe is not in the business of being fair, and waiting for it to start being fair before you decide to act is just a slower way of giving up. So she dealt with it. The Pentagon Papers became one of the most important stories in the history of journalism. Watergate took down an entire presidential administration and won the Post a Pulitzer Prize. The aggressive investor she had been warned about turned out to be a young Warren Buffett, who became her mentor and one of her closest advisors. The strike ended. Her main competitor in Washington went out of business and was absorbed by the Post. And then, in the late 70s, against the advice of nearly everyone, she did something almost no CEO at the time was doing. She spent the company's money buying back her own stock, 40% of the company's shares, at $20 a share. Less than a decade later, those same shares would be worth more than $300. If you had invested $1 in the Post when she took it public in 1971, by the time she stepped down, it would have been worth $89. Her industry as a whole returned 14. The S&P returned 5. She is one of the greatest CEOs in the history of American business, and almost nobody who has ever heard the word failure would have predicted that for the housewife who napped through her husband's suicide. So why do some people come back from the bottom and other people don't? In the early 1980s, a different man named John DeLorean ran an automobile company straight into the ground. His car was famous. The company was a disaster. Management was a mess. The cars didn't work. Losses ran into hundreds of millions of dollars. He had a choice in front of him: acknowledge the mistakes, step back, salvage what could be salvaged. Instead, he tried to save the company by arranging a $60 million cocaine deal. He is on video, actually holding a baggie of cocaine, with giddy excitement saying this stuff is as good as gold. He was arrested. The company collapsed anyway. His career and reputation never recovered. What had happened? Ego had happened. When you have tied your identity so completely to the thing that is failing, the failure of the thing feels like the failure of you as a person. So you fight, you scheme, you escalate. You make a bad situation catastrophically worse, because anything is more bearable than the simple admission that maybe you got it wrong. Steve Jobs, when he was fired from Apple in his 30s, had every right to spiral the same way. He had built that company. They had taken it from him, he cried. He fought. He sold all but one share of his stock. But then, slowly, painfully, humbly, he started something else. He learned from his management mistakes. He came back almost a decade later with the lessons absorbed, and he became the version of himself you actually remember. The difference between DeLorean and Jobs was not talent, it was not luck, it was whether they could draw a line and stop digging when the hole got deep enough. But there is one more way that ego ruins the comeback, and it is the most subtle one of all. In 1941, a 26-year-old prodigy named Orson Welles released his first feature film. It was the story of a fictional newspaper baron who had become a prisoner of his own empire. The man it most resembled, though Welles never said this directly, was the most powerful media figure in America at the time, a man named William Randolph Hearst. The film was called Citizen Kane. Hearst had probably never seen the movie. It did not matter. He spent the next decade of his life trying to destroy it. He sent his most powerful gossip columnist to threaten the studio. He banned any mention of Wells or the production company in any of his newspapers. He offered $800,000 to purchase the film outright so he could burn it. He pressured theater chains into refusing to screen it. He had stories planted about Wells's private life. He even reportedly used his influence with J. Edgar Hoover to get an FBI file opened on the man. How is Hearst remembered today? As a man who tried to destroy one of the greatest films ever made because his ego could not stand being possibly portrayed unflatteringly. He cemented his own villain status more thoroughly than any critic ever could have. And how did Orson Welles respond? He told a story later about bumping into Hearst in an elevator on the night of the film's premiere. The very premiere Hearst had spent months trying to prevent. And do you know what Welles did? He invited Hearst to come to the screening. When Hearst declined, Welles joked that Charles Foster Kane, the character in the film, surely would have accepted. Welles spent the rest of his life making other movies, lots of them, and according to people who knew him well, he never let the campaign against him turn into resentment. His longtime girlfriend at his funeral made it a point to say so. "I promise you," she said, "it didn't make him bitter. Hate in failure is the easiest thing in the world, the most natural thing. It defers blame. It makes someone else responsible. It gives you something to do with the energy of the wound, and it accomplishes essentially nothing, except keeping you exactly where you are." We're so used to thinking that revenge is strength, that holding on to the grievance is dignity, but almost universally, the people who hurt you, and the people who betray you, and the people who slighted you on the way down, the bad in them contains its own punishment. You don't need to add to it. You don't need to make their cancer your cancer. Love is what gets you back up. Or at the very least, let it go. So this is the way back. You take responsibility for what's now yours. You draw a line at the digging. You refuse to let the wound become your identity. You measure yourself by your own standards, not by the noise of people who never knew what was happening inside you to begin with. And you keep going, quietly, without needing to announce it. So let me pull this together. Because if you take only one thing from this hour, I want to make sure it's the right thing. We have walked through 3 stages of a life: aspiration, success, failure, and ego, as we have seen, is the silent enemy at every one of them. When you are aspiring, ego tells you that talking is the same thing as doing, that passion is the same as purpose, that early pride is the reward for talent rather than the killer of it. The cure on this side of the journey is humility, real humility, Sherman-style humility, the kind that turns down promotions you have not yet earned, that hires the teacher even after you have already made it, that keeps quiet on the way up and lets the work do the talking when the work is finally worth listening to. When you are succeeding, ego tells you a different story. It tells you that you saw it all coming, that you deserve everything you have, that the rules do not apply to you anymore, that the people around you are either fans or threats. The cure here is sobriety, the discipline to keep returning to the standard of performance the way Walsh did, the Marshall-like ability to hand someone else the trophy when the trophy is not the point, the recognition when you stand in front of an ocean at night that you are one short visitor in a story much, much older than you are, and when you are failing, when the floor has actually given out. Ego does the worst thing of all. It tries to convince you that this is who you are now, that the fall is your name, that the only way through is to dig harder or strike back at whoever you can blame. The cure, on this side, is restraint. Restraint from making it worse. Restraint from hating the people who hurt you. Restraint from believing the story of your own destruction. Like Graham, you take what is now yours, regardless of how it became yours. Like Wells, you refuse to make their bitterness your bitterness. Like Malcolm X, you turn the cell into the classroom. Humility on the way up, sobriety at the top, restraint on the way down. These are the 3 quiet practices that the great ones share, and the rest of us are constantly fumbling. But underneath all 3 of them is a single foundation: the work itself, not the praise for the work, not the recognition for the work, not the title that comes with the work. The work, the standard, the 1,000 small things done correctly when no one is watching, the hours nobody will ever know about, the detail you fixed even though no one would have caught it if you hadn't. Because the people we have just met all share that one trait. They cared about the work more than they cared about being seen doing the work. Hammett went back to lessons. Belichick volunteered without pay. Marshall handed away his moment of glory. Belisarius did his duty knowing he would never be thanked. Graham bought back her own company while the market called her a fool. Every one of them measured themselves by a scorecard nobody else could see. Warren Buffett has a name for this. He calls it the inner scorecard. There is the outer scorecard, the one society keeps on you, the titles, the salary, the followers, the headlines, and then there is the inner one, the one you keep on yourself, that no one else has access to. Most people live by the outer one, and most people are deeply unhappy. The ones who are at peace, almost without exception, are living by the inner one. And here is the part of this idea that almost nobody talks about, and it is the part one most want to leave you with. There is no graduation from this work. There is no day when the ego is finally defeated and you can move on to other things. It comes back. It always comes back. Ryan Holiday has a friend who is a martial artist, and his friend told him once that training was like sweeping the floor. Just because you have swept the floor today does not mean the floor is clean forever. Every single day, the dust comes back. Every single day, you have to sweep again. Now you might think, well, what kind of victory is that? If the work is never finished, what is the point of doing it at all? But that is exactly the point. The point is that no one finishes, no one alive, no one who has ever lived. The greatest figures in history did not beat their ego once and walk away. They beat it again and again and again every single day they were alive. They had bad days. They had moments where it won. They got back up the next morning and they did the sweeping again. There is something genuinely freeing in that because it means the question is never, am I good enough? The question is just, did I sweep today? And if you didn't, that is fine. Tomorrow is another day, sweep then. Which brings me back one last time to where we started, to a quiet colonel in 1973, sitting across from a young officer at the start of his career, drawing a fork on a desk between them, to be or to do? That was the question Boyd asked. That is the question this whole book asks. And the thing is, you are going to face that question more than once in your life. You are going to face it every time you get something new, every time you lose something old, every time the world says you are now somebody and waits to see what you do with that. Every time the world says you are nothing and waits to see whether you believe it. Every single time. So I want to leave you with one honest question. Not a big rhetorical one, but a small specific one I hope you actually sit with sometime in the next day or two. Where in your life, right now, is your ego costing you something you cannot see? Maybe it is a conversation you have been avoiding because admitting you were wrong would be humiliating. Maybe it is a relationship you are sabotaging because being right matters more than being together. Maybe it is a piece of work you keep talking about instead of doing. Maybe it is a wound you keep nursing because the bitterness feels like a kind of strength. Maybe it is the chase itself, the constant pursuit of something you don't even want anymore because slowing down feels like losing. Ego is almost never loud. It is almost never the obvious villain. It is the quiet voice that has been with you so long you have mistaken it for your own. If you want to spend more time with this one, I genuinely recommend it. Ego is the Enemy is a short book. You can finish it on a couple of long evenings, and the full version contains stories I had to leave out for time. There's an Amazon and Audible link in the description, and if you go through those, it supports the channel at no extra cost to you. I would not put it there if I didn't think the book was worth your evening. If anything in this last hour landed for you, if any of these stories stuck, subscribe to the channel. I do this every week. One book, one full deep dive. The kind of thing you can actually carry with you. And if you have a story of your own about a moment ego cost you something, or a moment you fought it and won, leave it in the comments below. I read them. But for right now, just remember the fork on the desk. And remember Boyd's question, to be or to do, which way will you go?